even in this brief discussion, you had a chance to think about some stories of your own that you can share with your grandkids. One of the things Glenn didn't mention is, and he's talked to me about this story a lot, is the feelings he felt afterwards, the guilt and the shame he carried over what he had done, and he said he never did it again after that because it was too heavy. That we learn, and there's that peer pressure to want to please our kids' peers, and sometimes they make decisions, and we ourselves did, that can really impact lives. And he was fortunate that nothing more came of that story. But we want to go on further and talk to you about how to tell your stories. So I'm going to talk about these 3 points. And I just want to say that no matter when you're giving your stories, you need to be pointing it to the growth of your faith. Your kids need to know that you have a story, a faith conversion story, so that they understand the importance of making that their own too, right? The faith isn't just something that happens because you're a part of a family, that each person needs to own their walk with the Lord and to develop that and through your own stories. And I ask myself often, why is it so hard to share these type of stories? Why is it that it's easier to lecture and talk about values than to open up and share what God has done in our life? And I think sometimes there's that fear of, what will my grandkids or kids think of me if they know I made a mistake? Well, they think it's okay. But I'm going to tell you, you will be more relatable. You will be someone who they might listen to more if they see your human side. And your growth from a child to where you are now is a journey of up and down and lessons. And they need to know that theirs is too. So no matter what, always include your faith conversion stories. Did you know that when they did studies that most grandparents don't? Most grandparents just talk about faith as an external thing, or they share what it means, what the gospel means, but they don't talk about their own journey of coming to faith. And I have to ask myself, why is that? Why is it that we don't want to share our own personal journeys? I think it's maybe if you're in Glenn's and my generation, there was this feeling of being vulnerable and not opening up, and so you kept it very, very not personal. And I want to say that this generation of kids, and even the young families we see today, they're about authenticity. They're about walking out life with you together and knowing that you actually learned some things along the way too, that you weren't born perfect, okay? They need to know that there was a journey of growth for you as well. So I encourage you to kind of drop down that feeling of needing to put on this perfect look or this lectury approach. And that's my second point, is it's far more influential to teach through life experiences rather than lectures. Lectures are easy, but kids tune them out. They don't listen, they don't want another lecture, but they really perk up their ears if you can make it personal. And here's a story I'm going to share with my grandkids that I haven't shared yet with them. And I was thinking about it this week when I was talking about stories that we could share with our grandkids, because we're always talking about working your hardest and not being afraid to lay it on the line. And I thought, okay, I have a story. I have lots of stories in that area. When I was in high school, I grew up in a very small community in Oregon. And it was a tiny high school. And in Oregon at that time, I ran track. You ran against all sizes of school. And so from this tiny community, we went to the district track meet in Portland, which was a big city, and all of these schools had come together to run track. And the top 2 people in every event would go to state. And I was a freshman, and they put me in at the time it was the 880. Now I don't have the 880 anymore. That tells you how old I am. It's 800 now. I'd never ran before. So I had no idea what it took to run an 880. So I just got in those blocks, and I ran my hardest, and I got second place. And I was like, whoa, everybody was like, whoa, she did really, really well. I threw up. I was so tired, but I was so elated. Well, What happened after that is suddenly there were expectations on me. I was going to state, and suddenly the coaches and the students and everybody had huge expectations on what I would do at state. So any idea what I did? I completely faltered because I was too afraid I would not meet these expectations. So I purposely went out there in that race, and I remember it to this day, and I didn't try. I came in dead last, okay? And I had all sorts of excuses. I was sick, I was tired, but inside I knew I had been too afraid to lay it on the line. But that disappointment over that race at state that year and what I did stayed with me, and that was a far greater pain than the pain of having ran my hardest. Does that make sense? And so when I talk to my grandkids about the fact that you're going to be more disappointed if you don't lay it on the line when you try than if you go out there and just really lay it on the line. I've never really shared that story, but that story makes it more real, doesn't it? And I would encourage you to think of those times and those stories that you have learned and carried forward with you that you can share too, because they're going to listen. I know my grandkids will listen to that story rather than the just do your best. So that was an impetus for me in my life for not giving up after that. It was an impetus for me to work harder and lay things on the line and not back down, because I hated the feeling after that state race. I really, really did. Third point I want to make is you do need to describe the feelings you experience along the way. They need to know of what you did when you made bad choices and how that made you feel, how you felt when you overcame those bad choices and did something right. Like for Glenn, never doing that again, that was a much better place for him, even with how he felt about himself, than how he felt after he had made the choices of selling his friends liquor or giving his friends liquor. So point being, you cannot leave out the impact it has on you. And I was thinking of Glenn's mom. She died at 67, really a young age, of lung cancer. She had never smoked. Just this steadfast woman of faith who grew up in the church. She was German, and she was not going to open up her heart about anything. You knew you never had a personal discussion with Glenn's mom, because as soon as it turned personal, she shut down. It was all about just doing and performance and lecture, but you'd never. So none of us really, really felt like we connected with her. I appreciated her. I admired her. But I didn't really know who she was. Well, in her last 3 weeks, when she was dying of cancer, she suddenly started to talk. And she just poured out her feelings and emotions and her regrets and the things she had faced and the things she would do differently. And it was in those 3 weeks that she left more of a legacy of her life than all the years before, because we actually got to see her heart. And I remember as a young mom, and as a mom, kind of a middle-aged kids then, how that impacted me when I got to hear actually what she felt and what she learned and the disappointment she faced. And that really, really connected us to his mom. And I so wish she could have seen the ability to do that before. Does that make sense? And that's what I want to make sure I don't leave out for my grandkids, that I share with them not just what I expect of them, but these feelings and emotions and disappointments that I have in my own life too. And I just want to say, this is kind of a side note right now, but sometimes as grandparents, we have to, well, if you're like, and I hear this a lot, we need to let go of any hurt and offense, because that blocks our influence. We need to be wise enough to not hold on to hurt when we feel ignored by our kids or grandkids, or when we feel put down, or when our advice isn't accepted, when we're blamed for things. Those things happen, but we need to rise above that. We need to still be in the position of choosing influence and setting a standard and taking the high road over and over, modeling an unconditional love for our kids and grandkids so that they have a safe place to come. Because not only do your adult kids need you, but so do your grandkids. They need a place where they can come and be authentic and real and share their feelings and thoughts and share what they're honestly thinking without worrying about how it's going to affect you. So Glenn's going to talk about the next 2 points.
One of my biggest passions when I talk is on courage or grit. I love that. And I think if we can find stories that are going to talk about grit, putting grit into your kids, our kids today do not have a lot of courage, a lot of grit. That is one of the things that is missing in their lives. One of the things Ellen and I get to talk a lot about is what we call intentional Christian grandparenting. Being intentional about what we say, what we do, the stories we tell, and making sure that they're not just for fun, but they're intentionally have that message for our kids. And so grit is one of mine. Courage, resilience, as Ellen said, sisu, we want to teach that to them. There was a study done with dogs. And what they did is they took these dogs and they put them in a cage and then they shocked their feet. They sent an electrical shock and you think, wow, that's mean. And there were 2 groups of dogs. The first group, if they hit their nose on the front of the cage, the shock stopped. And so then they'd give them some time and then they'd start the shock again. They'd hit their nose and the shock would stop. And so this really unpleasant thing was that they were able to overcome it. The second group of dogs, they had no way out. For 20 seconds, they got shocked. And there was just no way out. About 6 months later, they brought the dogs back. And they put the first group in, the group that had a way out, and the front of the cage no longer worked. But there was a fence over here that they could jump over. And so this first group of dogs that had a way out the first time, when they started shocking them, they hit their nose and it didn't work. But they looked around. What can I do? What can I do? How can I make this? What kind of thing am I going to have to do to get away from this? 100% of those dogs in that group figured out the fence and jumped over. 100% of them. They brought the second group in and they shocked them. This is the group that had no way out the first time. They couldn't do it. About a third of that group jumped over the fence. And the other 2/3 just laid down and took it. Just laid down and took that. And they said, how does this relate to humans? And what they did is through their study, they found that the ideal age for that tough experience was 10 to 14 years old. That was the best learning time for our kids, 10 to 14. If they could have something that's just not going to work out well, they failed a test, they didn't start that project till way too late, something that they can really learn from. And they started investigating these kids. And the ones that worked through it at age 10 to 14, at age 17 and age 20, were still working through it. They were like the 100% of the dogs that jumped the fence. The other half of the kids, they found that about 1/3 of them battled through. And the reason that those kids at 10 to 14 were unable to overcome that tough problem was mostly poverty. These kids grew up without any resources, no parents, nobody to help them through those tough times at age 10 to 14. What they found that the kids that grew up in poverty, still a large group of them were able to jump over the fence. They were able to work their way out of that. There's 2/3 left. 1/3 of those that were left were poverty as well. And they just laid down and died. They just laid down and took it. And that's that group of poverty kids that are going to live in poverty all their life. They're going to live tough lives and they're never going to get over the top. That left another third. And that was the interesting group. And that's the group that applies to us. They called them the fragile perfects. These are the kids that had all the resources. But at age 10 to 14, instead of their parents letting them battle through and fail and have to get courage and work their way out of a problem, the parents came what? Swooping in, fix the problem. Professors call these kids snowflakes. The minute that it gets warm in my class, they melt. And that's the kids. Those are the kids that we have to teach the grit to. So when I talk about grit, the first thing I do is I pray every one of my kids, age 10 to 14, my grandkids, has a really tough something that happens to them. And that their parents back off, maybe give them some advice, but not a whole lot, and let them work it out and work it through and figure out and develop courage. I pray for that. We try and tell stories, a lot of stories about grit.
So if they ask for your help on a late project, you just only give them a little bit then?
Or you say, well, we'll take care of this in the morning. I know that that's due tomorrow, but I'm not going to run to Walmart and pick up all this stuff for you. And what are you going to tell your teacher? And how are you going to work out with your teacher so that...
Well, not the Walmart part, but your time of help.
Sure.
How you just...
We have parents that we know of throughout our school experiences who stay up all night finishing the project for their kid, you know? And
So I get, not that part, but like
Yeah.
giving them you're not saying don't give them any of your time if they come to you for help, but just don't do it for them.
well, and I think good questions. How are you going to work through this? What are you going to have to do to make this right? You know, and those are the important, critical things you need to say. But I think it's so important for us to do that. Pray for that courage lesson and give them examples of how you had grit, how you had courage, what you did. You know, as I think about this situation, I think I was a fragile perfect. I don't have a lot of grit. I'm not that tenacious, go get 'em that I should be. And I think there were two reasons for me. The first one is I don't remember a really tough thing at age 10 to 14 that I had to work my way through. I don't remember my parents coming in and swooping in, but I don't think I had any. The second thing that makes me what we call risk averse is I grew up in a very critical home. I could never do anything right. And you need to think about that. If you have a little bit of a critical spirit in your house, that's not a good thing. It makes kids risk averse. I just didn't want to try. I was one of those that kind of wanted to just lay down and let it happen. And so I encourage you to think about that and think about your stories. And so there's a little talk on grit. I think it's so critical. The other one I want to talk about today is humor. Humor is so great, such a great thing to have in our talks. Now, as a dad, as a grandpa, I have to be careful. Humor, sarcasm, very different. I tend toward the gift of criticism and sarcasm. Those are my spiritual gifts. And so I have to be very careful to stay away from that one. We can choose to be funny and fun, right? And as grandparents, yeah, we ache once in a while. And being funny and fun is not part of the whole show. But boy, we can choose that. I love this saying. I think there's one up there. You don't stop laughing because you grow old because you stop laughing. I think that's so true. We can choose to be joyful rather than grouchy. You know, they've done a bunch of research. I'm sure a lot of you have read it, but laughing decreases stress hormones, increases infection-fighting antibodies. We should be laughing a lot, right? Those are good things. Laughter triggers endorphins, and they actually make you feel better and are temporary pain relief. So if you're hurting, laugh, right? Got to think of something. Watch that good movie. The second one here says, laughter is the corrective force which prevents us from becoming cranks. There's some great Bible verses. Judges 19:6 says, let your heart be merry. Right? We just got to do that. Proverbs 15:15, he that has a merry heart has a continual feast. As soap is to the body, so laughter is to the soul. That's a Jewish proverb. Henry Bergson said, laughter is the corrective force which prevents us. Oh, that's the one that's up there right now. That one. All right. You know, one of the things I do want to talk about, though, is it's more important than that. The laughter, the humor, the fun is more important. A guy named Dr. Vern Bankston graduated in Arizona, got his doctorate degree, and he didn't know what he was going to do. 1970s, but he wanted to do something with families. He wanted families. There's got to be something here. And so he began interviewing 365 families every 3 months to see what the trends were, what the important stuff was. For 3 months, for 45 years. In 2017, he published a book. And he said, and his findings were on what makes our kids and our grandkids stay with their faith. Love God the way we love God. And he found 4 things, but I want to go over 2 of those with you. The first one was a warm and affirming house. In particular, a warm and affirming father. In particular, a warm and affirming father. Does humor make you warm and affirming? It's a great thing for that. Another one of the things he found was that grandparents are way more important than anybody ever thought. Grandparents are critical to that spiritual heritage. A warm and affirming grandparents, in particular, a warm and affirming grandfather. A lot of pressure on us guys. Warm and affirming father, warm and affirming grandfather. Last Sunday, we're going through Isaiah 9, the prediction of Jesus coming. There will be a child born. And this was an amazing verse. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And last Sunday, we did Everlasting Father in our church. And we had a girl get up who's one of the leader college. She's just out of college. And she said, Wonderful Counselor, I get that. I love that name for my God. He counsels me with my prayer life. As I read his scripture, as I read his words, I get counsel all the time. It's amazing. Mighty God, of course. My God's mighty. Look at all he's done. Look at all he's done in my life, right? She said, Everlasting Father. I grew up with no dad. I don't have a dad. And I can't figure out what an everlasting father is, what that looks like. And I thought, wow, not only do we need to be an everlasting father to teach our kids what that looks like, but even more, we need to be warm and affirming. A God that's critical and cranky and grouchy and tells stories. My dad was so critical of me all the time. I don't know. I still stayed in the faith because I loved God, but that wasn't the reason. Warm and affirming father. I grew up critical. My son's running the slides up there right now, and he's going, But I've worked so hard. And one of the neat things that my kids have said, there's stuff tender. We do a deal on birthdays, and everybody has to say nice things about you, right? Whether they want to or not. But words like tender came out for me. And I thought, wow, it took me a lot of years to get there. But warm and affirming. I want you, dads and grandpas, think about that one. When you tell those stories, have fun with them, be humorous with them, warm and affirming, right? So critical.
Well, I think stories do allow us to share in a way that is more warm and accepting. And so I just want to wrap up here now on this final part here and talk a little bit about my mom. So we're doing stories today, right? You know, my mom came to faith in her 40s, and so she wasn't in faith in her earlier years, but I do believe she came to faith through the prayers of her father and her grandmother and everything. And what was neat about my mom is that she became a prayer warrior. She really did. I want to read to you something. Let me see if I have it in here. I don't know where. Okay. She had. All right, I will find it. Here we go. When my mom passed away last year, and we got a lot of sympathy cards, and one of the cards that meant a lot to me came from our neighbor up the hill out in the country where we had lived. And here's what she wrote. She wrote, we moved to the old lake place in 1980, and Kertu was the first to visit, and she shared memories of Mrs. Lake, that was who used to live in the house, as we got to know each other. In one of our early conversations, she asked me, are you going to heaven? I said, my mom always asked everyone that when she came to the Lord. It was really cool. She said, I hope so. And my mom went on to Kertu went on to tell me that I could be sure. She says, Kertu is in my Hall of Fame, one of those people in my life who loved Jesus, lived out her faith, and pointed the way to Jesus for me. Through the years, any life problem I shared with her, she met it with prayer. She knew Jesus and enjoyed the abundant life he gave her. And one of the things that's neat about my mom is that she died of Alzheimer's, and so her last few years, we took her down here to Austin, and she was with us the last 2 years. She lived in our home for a year. And while her memory faded, her ability to pray never did. And she held that faith in her heart, because that was from here. So we could ask her to pray, and the words would flow. No memories, but that prayer life, that gift of the Lord in her never went away. And I think I want to be remembered in similar ways by my grandkids. I want to carry on this legacy of prayer and to be known as someone who knew Jesus and enjoyed the abundant life he offered. And I feel like if we think about what it is we want to be remembered for, it helps us kind of get into perspective what we need to be intentional about. But that was my mom. My kids and my grandkids all know that about her, because it didn't matter what problem you took to her. I remember my son Troy at her memorial service talking about a time he went to her with a headache, and she said, well, let's pray. And he kind of went, yeah, it's not going to work. And she prayed for him, and his headache went away. I mean, my kids know that you went to my mom to the problem, she was going to be on her knees in prayer. That was always her answer. And so I love the fact that prayer, this is Oswald Chambers, a saying he made. He says, prayer does not fit us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work. And that's something, whether you live by your grandkids or whether you're close by, that you be on your knees praying for them. I keep a prayer journal, and I have prayers about my grandkids and kids in there. If they ever read them, they might see some things that I'm concerned about and worried about, but be a praying grandparent. I think it's the greatest thing you can do for your kids, and I love the fact that we all know my mom's stories, and the fact that you knew she was a prayer warrior, and that's, I know, what she's remembered for. But we all have a history. We all have a family story, and each story in your history is kind of like a single thread in a tapestry that's woven with intricate colors and designs. And like a tapestry, you are a combination of the history and traditions that you inherited from your own families. So I challenge you to share these stories, and including the raw and the tough ones that motivated you to change, so that a tapestry that is forming for you in intricacy and design will move forward from your life to your kids and grandkids. And Christmas time is a fabulous time to share those stories, when you have family time together. So I'm hoping and praying for you that at this Christmas season, you'll have a chance to share some stories with your kids and grandkids. So we're going to close today, and I just want to tell you that if you are interested in Glenn's and my book, it is back there. One of us will be back there with you if you would like to buy one. It's full of our family stories and full of just some tips on how to connect and relate to your grandkids and kids. So we thank you so much for coming today, and hope you have a blessed day.
I just wanted to add, Troy is going to give a charge to all of our kids, kind of a Christmas break charge. And one of the things he's going to tell those kids to do is get with your aunts and uncles, your grandparents, and have them just tell you stories. So you're going to get asked. So be intentional and think it through ahead of time. What can I give them? What can I tell them? Because he's gonna tell them. That's part of their homework over this Christmas break. And so I encourage you to really be careful with that one and know and be intentional. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Let's close in prayer. Dear Lord, I hope we've given the parents and the grandparents here some skills, some things that they need to think about. And dear Lord, I just ask for you to bless this time. Bless this time that they will have with their children. Each of these Christmases is forming memories, great memories that the kids will have. And dear Lord, please help us to be part of those. Help us to do them in a way that's pleasing to you. Thank you, Lord, for Christmas time, the birth of your Son, the end result, dying on the cross for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Molly, did you have something?